The dawn of May 29, 1453, broke with a shuddering roar as Ottoman cannons thundered against the Theodosian walls. Constantinople, jewel of Christendom and last bastion of Byzantium, quaked under the relentless pounding. Dust rose like a funeral shroud, coating the air with the smell of stone, sulfur, and despair. Inside the city, priests carried relics through narrow streets, chanting prayers for divine salvation. Yet their voices were drowned by the crashing of iron balls tearing through towers and gates. The people followed in desperate processions, barefoot, carrying candles that flickered like their fading hope. The Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos rode along the walls, his armor dented but shining in the dim light. He urged his weary men to hold fast. Some were soldiers, others monks and merchants, all pressed into service. Their faces bore the deep hollows of hunger, for the city had been under siege for nearly 2 months. On the other side, Sultan Mehmed II stood tall, his youthful eyes burning with determination. At just 21 years old, he commanded one of the most formidable armies ever assembled, an ocean of men stretching into the horizon. Janissaries stood ready in their ranks, silent and disciplined, waiting for the signal. The bombardment reached its crescendo. Stones from the walls crumbled, creating gaps wide enough for men to pass through. Each breach was patched hastily with barrels, planks, and even the corpses of the fallen. Still, the tide pressed forward. The ground trembled with the march of tens of thousands of Ottoman feet. By mid-morning, the first wave surged. Screams rose as ladders slammed against the walls. Byzantine defenders poured boiling oil, hurled stones, and thrust spears downward. Blood slicked the ladders, and bodies toppled like broken dolls. Yet for every man who fell, another clambered up in his place. The clash was deafening. Steel rang against steel. Arrows hissed through the smoky air. Some janissaries captured defenders alive, dragging them screaming down ladders to the ground. Their wrists were bound, and knives traced slow, deliberate lines across their skin, meant to instill terror in the watching city. Women and children huddled in churches, listening to the rumble of war draw closer. Mothers whispered lullabies to mask the thunder of cannon fire. Priests raised icons of the Virgin, praying that heaven itself might descend to strike down the invaders. But heaven remained silent, and the earth quaked beneath their feet. Near the gate of St. Romanus, the fiercest fighting erupted. The Ottomans swarmed like locusts, climbing over heaps of their own dead to gain the walls. Constantine himself fought there, sword flashing, rallying the last fragments of courage in his men. For a moment it seemed the tide might yet be turned, but the great cannon known as the Basilica, a monstrous creation of Hungarian engineer Orban, roared again. Its shot smashed through masonry, creating a yawning gap. Through it surged wave after wave of soldiers, their battle cries mingling with the shrieks of the dying. Defenders caught in the breach were overwhelmed. Some were hacked down where they stood, limbs severed in a frenzy of steel. Others were seized, beaten with spear butts, and bound with ropes. These prisoners were not granted mercy. Their tongues were cut out to silence their cries, their bodies paraded before the walls as a spectacle. Within the city, panic began to spread. Bells tolled frantically from Hagia Sophia, summoning the faithful to prayer. But to many, it felt like a funeral knell. Crowds rushed toward the great church, believing its sanctuary would protect them. Mothers clutched children, fathers dragged carts of possessions, desperate to find shelter. Meanwhile, the Ottomans breached more gates. Horses thundered through the broken streets, trampling those who stumbled in terror. Soldiers hacked through doorways, dragging inhabitants from their homes. Some were beaten into submission, their hands bound with iron chains. Others were tortured on the spot, their cries echoing through alleys like the voice of doom. Captives were forced to kneel while blades hovered over their throats. Many begged in Greek Latin or broken Turkish, but mercy was a rare commodity. Some soldiers enjoyed prolonging the agony, burning flesh with torches, driving nails through palms, tearing beards from men's faces before killing them. The defenders fought valiantly, but exhaustion was their undoing. Weeks of starvation had weakened their arms. Men collapsed mid-swing, too faint to lift their swords again. They were dragged off by the enemy, their armor stripped, their bodies beaten until bones cracked. Others were impaled on pikes and raised above the walls as warnings. By midday, the Ottomans controlled much of the outer defences. Fires spread through wooden homes, filling the sky with smoke. The acrid stench of burning timbers mixed with the iron tang of blood. Everywhere, the wails of the living mingled with the silence of the dead. In the heart of the city, Constantine gathered his final guard. He addressed them with words heavy yet resolute. "The hour has come. Let us not dishonor our fathers or our faith." With that, he charged into the fray, striking with the fury of a man who knew death was certain. Around him, the last remnants of Byzantine nobility and commoners alike fought side by side. They formed a desperate shield wall, but the sheer tide of Janissaries broke it apart. Men were dragged screaming into alleys, their fingernails torn out, their screams stifled by blades driven into their mouths. The Ottomans advanced toward Hagia Sophia. The massive church doors were barred, but they splintered beneath the blows of axes. Inside, thousands had gathered, clutching icons, praying for a miracle. When the soldiers stormed in, chaos erupted. Some women threw themselves before the altar, only to be dragged away by their hair. Children were torn from mothers' arms, their small voices wailing as they were herded outside like livestock. Priests were beaten and bound, their vestments ripped and stained with blood. The sacred mosaics that had watched over centuries of worship now bore witness to scenes of terror. By late afternoon, the city that had withstood 1,000 years of sieges lay broken. Its streets were slick with gore, its alleys filled with the tortured and enslaved, the sound of chains clattering mixed with the moans of the dying. Constantinople's last breath was drawn in agony, its fate sealed by fire and steel. And yet, even as darkness began to fall, the torment was far from over, for the conquerors had only begun to exact their vengeance upon the conquered. As dusk fell on May 29, 1453, the city was no longer Byzantium, it was the spoils of empire. The Ottomans flooded the streets, torches in hand, their laughter echoing against shattered walls. Constantinople, once the queen of cities, now lay bleeding under the boots of its conquerors. The conquerors' first hunger was not for gold but for bodies. Men were bound in ropes and iron shackles, marched like cattle toward the camp outside the walls. The stronger ones were beaten into compliance, their backs striped with lashes. The weak were clubbed to the ground, left in pools of blood as warnings. Women fared no better. Soldiers dragged them from hiding places, ignoring their cries and clawing resistance. Noble women in silks, peasant wives in rags, all were stripped of dignity. Some were hauled into the open, their hair hacked short in mockery, their flesh branded with hot irons to mark them as spoils of war. The streets rang with screams. Children were torn from their mothers' arms, many too small to comprehend their fate. Some were kicked into wagons bound for slavery in Anatolia. Others were pierced with spears when they slowed the march. Their tiny bodies were left in gutters, bathed in the fading glow of firelight. Hagia Sophia, the city's holiest sanctuary, became a prison of horrors. The once golden dome now shook with shrieks and sobs. Families who had fled there believing it a refuge were rounded up at sword point. Chains rattled as the faithful were divided, men to one side, women and children to another, each awaiting their torment. Priests in their vestments were forced to kneel before the altar. Some were ordered to spit on their own icons. Those who refused were whipped until their backs split open. Others were mutilated, tongues sliced, fingers severed, before being dragged out to the streets. Their bodies were trophies of humiliation. The soldiers' frenzy spread from home to home. Doors were battered down, treasures ripped from shelves, tapestries torn from walls, gold chalices, jeweled crosses, and family heirlooms vanished into sacks. But even amid plunder, cruelty was entertainment. Captives were forced to watch as their loved ones were beaten or violated before their eyes. Noble courtyards became arenas of torment. Some prisoners were tied to pillars and scourged with knotted cords until flesh hung in ribbons. Others were made sport of, forced to crawl on hands and knees while soldiers jeered and struck them with spear shafts. Their cries blended with the crackle of flames consuming mansions. The Ottomans herded groups of young men into squares, binding them hand to foot. Some were branded with the crescent, their flesh sizzling under red-hot irons. Others had nails hammered through their ears to wooden posts, left dangling in agony until they collapsed. Terror spread faster than fire through the city's veins. Constantine the last emperor, was nowhere to be found. Rumors whispered he had fallen in battle, his body trampled beyond recognition. Some claimed he had fled, vanishing into legend. But for the ordinary people of the city, there was no escape. Their suffering was the final tribute to a fallen empire. By torchlight, janissaries scoured the monasteries. Monks were dragged from their cells, their beards torn out by fists. Some were strung upside down, their bodies whipped until the stone walls dripped with blood. Others were forced to renounce Christ, knives pressed against their throats. The choice between apostasy and mutilation. The night deepened, and with it, cruelty. In the narrow lanes of Blachernay, captives were tied to stakes. Soldiers lit fires at their feet, laughing as flames licked upward. Some were spared death only to be sold later, their charred bodies a grim reminder of survival bought at a heavy price. The sea gates were thrown open, and ships dragged away hundreds more. Entire families were forced aboard, shackled to benches in suffocating holds, their wails carried across the Bosporus, mixing with the chants of victory sung by the conquerors. For these prisoners, Constantinople was not the end but the beginning of chains. In the palaces, Ottoman officers claimed their prizes. Noblewomen were veiled in silks paraded as tokens of conquest. Some were beaten when they resisted, their jewels ripped from ears and noses, blood staining their finery. Their fate was sealed in the harems of distant masters. The ordinary citizens suffered with equal brutality. Bakers, smiths, and merchants were dragged into the streets, their shops gutted. Many were tied to wheels and beaten with rods until they could no longer stand. Others were burned alive inside their own workshops, their livelihoods consumed with their bodies. At every corner, bodies hung from posts. Some were flayed, their skins nailed to gates as ghastly banners. Others were impaled, the stakes driven slowly through their torsos, so their screams lasted for hours. The gruesome display was meant to break the last threads of resistance. Children who were spared were not spared innocence. Many were drafted into the Ottoman ranks, forced to convert and trained as janissaries. Boys no older than 10 were ripped from their homes, their cries echoing down stone streets. Parents clawed at the soldiers only to be cut down where they stood. In the once proud hippodrome, chains of prisoners were gathered beneath the moon. They were counted, branded, and divided for sale. Families wept as fathers were dragged one way, mothers another, children another still. Their sobs rose into the night, like a hymn of despair, unheard by any god. The city's treasures were stripped. Bronze statues, centuries old, were toppled and melted for coin. Relics that had drawn pilgrims for generations were smashed. Even the icons of Christ and the Virgin were defiled, spat upon, their gold frames torn apart. The conquerors cared nothing for their sanctity, only for the spoils. Midnight came, but the torment did not cease. In dark alleys, screams pierced the silence as soldiers indulged in cruelty. Men were disemboweled slowly, their guts pulled out for sport. Women were branded on their faces with hot metal. Children were bound to posts and forced to watch until their eyes glazed with terror. The empire that had withstood centuries of sieges and storms now lay utterly broken. Its people were shackled, its churches defiled, its streets soaked with blood. Constantinople had not simply fallen, it had been ground into dust beneath the weight of vengeance and greed. And yet, as the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, the horrors of that night proved only the beginning, for the victors had yet to proclaim their dominion, and their triumph would demand new sacrifices. Dawn broke over Constantinople with a sky streaked in crimson, as if the heavens themselves had absorbed the blood spilled below. Smoke curled from charred houses, drifting like funeral incense. The queen of cities, once radiant with mosaics and domes, now looked like a corpse dismembered in the night. The Ottomans moved with renewed purpose. The night's frenzy of looting and torture had not satisfied their hunger. Now order was imposed, not to bring peace, but to ensure every scrap of value was wrung from the broken city. Chains clattered as prisoners were gathered in markets, their fates sealed by the whip. Sultan Mehmed II entered through the gate of St. Romanus, surveying the ruin he had long dreamed of conquering. His men bowed low, offering severed heads and bound captives as trophies. The Sultan accepted them with cold detachment. This was victory, but it demanded spectacle to etch terror into memory. In the squares, platforms were erected. Prisoners, Byzantine nobles, priests and soldiers, were hauled up for execution. Some were beheaded swiftly, their blood soaking into wooden planks. Others were tortured first, flayed with knives, their screams echoing through the morning air, as Mehmed's troops watched with grim delight. Among the captives were scholars and scribes. Many were ordered to renounce their faith, their books seized and burned in heaps. Some resisted, clutching their manuscripts until blades hacked their hands away. Others were nailed to doors with quills through their palms, a cruel parody of the words they had once written. In Hagia Sophia, now a mosque by decree, the surviving congregation was forced to kneel beneath the new banners. Some who resisted were dragged into the nave and beaten with staves until blood splashed across marble floors. The sanctity of centuries dissolved under the boots of soldiers who reveled in their conquest. Elsewhere, the torture grew inventive. Captives were tied together by their hair and dragged behind horses through the streets. Others were strung between columns, their bodies whipped until skins sloughed away. Some were forced to drink brackish water mixed with ash, choking as soldiers mocked their prayers for mercy. The hippodrome became an arena of cruelty. Survivors were pitted against each other in brutal contests. Fathers were forced to fight sons, brothers against brothers, while soldiers jeered and placed wagers. The losers were hacked apart, their corpses tossed onto piles that smoldered like funeral pyres. The emperor's body, when finally discovered, was mutilated. His head was severed and paraded on a pike through the city. Crowds of captives were forced to watch, their knees pressed into the dirt, while soldiers spat on the remains of their sovereign. The last emperor of Byzantium became an object of mockery. In the markets, women were auctioned like cattle. Chains around their necks clinked as bidders examined them, prodding with rough hands. Some were beaten when they resisted, their clothes torn in public humiliation. The youngest fetched the highest price, their faces streaked with tears as they were led away to foreign harems. Children who had not already been slain were gathered for the Devshirme levy. Soldiers marked them with soot, designating them for conversion and military service. Parents shrieked, clawing at the ground, some slitting their own throats rather than see their children taken. The soldiers dragged the living forward, unmoved by the despair. Not even the dead were spared in dignity. Graves were cracked open, bones scattered, and tombs defiled in the hunt for hidden treasures. The bodies of saints were stripped of relics, their remains mocked and trampled. The city's memory, carved in stone and flesh alike, was desecrated without hesitation. Through the long hours of the day, the torment spread. In alleys, captives were crucified on makeshift crosses. Others were boiled alive in cauldrons, their screams carrying through stone arches. Fires devoured whole districts, not by accident, but as punishment for resistance. Smoke mingled with the stench of blood and charred flesh. The city's defenders who had surrendered were not spared. Many were skinned alive outside the walls, their hides displayed like banners. Others were impaled along the roads leading into the city, their bodies swaying in the wind, a message to all who might defy Ottoman power. By evening, silence began to descend. It was not the peace of relief, but the silence of exhaustion. The cries of the tortured grew hoarse, fading into whispers. Chains rattled in steady rhythm as lines of captives shuffled toward galleys waiting at the harbor. Constantinople's people had become currency in the empire's expansion. The once proud palaces now stood hollow. Gold, jewels, and silks had been stripped. The halls where emperors once walked were littered with corpses, their eyes staring blankly at the vaulted ceilings. Rats scurried over them, the only inheritors of centuries of grandeur. The conquerors feasted that night. Fires lit the skyline as soldiers gorged on stolen wine and meat. Drunken laughter rose where once hymns had been sung. Tortured prisoners were dragged into the revelry, forced to dance until they collapsed, beaten when they faltered, killed when they refused.